On the evening of February 22, 2026, Mexican Special Forces conducted a raid on the small highland town of Tapalpa in Jalisco State, targeting one of the most wanted figures in the Western Hemisphere. And what followed over the next 48 hours would shock a country already long accustomed to the horrors of cartel violence. The operation ended with the wounding and subsequent death of Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes, the founder and supreme leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, known by its Spanish acronym, CJNG, and the man widely regarded as Mexico's most powerful drug lord since the imprisonment of Joaquin Guzman nearly a decade earlier. Oseguera, who operated under the alias El Mencho, was an elusive and deeply feared figure whose organization had evolved from a regional criminal outfit into one of the most dangerous and structurally sophisticated cartels the world had ever encountered. During the raid, government forces engaged cartel members in an intense firefight that left 4 of them dead and 3 wounded, including Oseguera himself, while 2 additional suspects were taken into custody and authorities seized an arsenal that included armored vehicles and rocket launchers, with 3 Mexican soldiers sustaining injuries during the confrontation. Oseguera was being transported to Mexico City for medical treatment when he died from his wounds. White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt confirmed in an official statement that American intelligence agencies had provided critical support for the operation, describing Oseguera as a top priority for both governments due to his central role in the trafficking of fentanyl into the United States, while Mexican authorities declined to elaborate on the specific methods used to locate him. A strategic silence intended to preserve operational techniques that might be applied in future operations against other cartel figures. What followed in the immediate aftermath was a wave of coordinated violence on a scale that stunned even those accustomed to the chronic brutality of Mexico's drug war, a response that was swift, meticulously orchestrated, and genuinely national in scope. In Puerto Vallarta, the popular Pacific Coast resort city that draws hundreds of thousands of international tourists annually, armed cartel members seized control of major arterial roads and torched buses and heavy trucks to create smoldering barricades that immobilized entire districts, while smoke rose over the beachfront city as fires spread through neighborhoods and streets that had been filled with vacationers. Just hours earlier fell silent, emptied by the sound of gunfire and the sight of armed men conducting patrols from the beds of pickup trucks. American tourists described the scene in terms that strained for adequate language: surreal, terrifying, unlike anything previously encountered. And one long-term resident who had lived in Puerto Vallarta for more than 2 decades stated that he had never witnessed anything remotely comparable in all his years there. Witnesses reported armed cartel members ordering civilians out of their vehicles at gunpoint, and at least one account described what appeared to be a public execution taking place on an open road, while a jail guard was killed during a prisoner riot within the city, and an official from the Jalisco State Prosecutor's Office was murdered in Guadalajara. The National Guard, deployed across the region to contain the unrest, suffered significant casualties, 7 members killed in Jalisco and 6 more in Zapopan, a municipality on the outskirts of Guadalajara, and the body count climbed steadily as the hours passed. The violence was by no means confined to the Jalisco coastline, and in Guadalajara itself, the state capital and Mexico's second-largest city with a population of approximately 5 million people. Chaos descended on the international airport as travelers dove behind check-in counters while gunfire echoed in the vicinity, and airport workers in high-visibility vests abandoned their stations and fled in panic. In the state of Guanajuato, authorities documented dozens of simultaneous attacks spanning 23 municipalities, with cartel operatives systematically setting fire to banks and convenience stores in what appeared to be a coordinated campaign of economic disruption and public intimidation designed to demonstrate reach and resolve in equal measure. Mexican federal authorities ultimately reported more than 250 roadblocks erected across 20 states, effectively choking off transit across enormous swaths of the country and paralyzing commerce, emergency services, and civilian movement on a scale without modern precedent. Airlines including Southwest, Alaska, and Delta suspended flights to both Puerto Vallarta and Guadalajara, leaving thousands of international travelers stranded without means of departure. And the United States Embassy issued urgent advisories instructing American citizens across multiple Mexican states to shelter in place and await further guidance. By the following morning, government forces had cleared most of the roadblocks, but the damage, physical, psychological, economic, and reputational, had already been absorbed by the nation. and schools across multiple states remained closed as residents processed what had just occurred. To understand the depth, reach, and organizational coherence of this response, it is necessary to appreciate the particular character of the institution that Oseguera had constructed since the CJNG's founding in 2011. Because the cartel he built was distinguished not simply by its appetite for violence, which was endemic across Mexican organized crime, but by a level of structural sophistication that analysts at the American National Counterterrorism Center compared more to a multinational corporate enterprise than to a traditional criminal hierarchy. Oseguera had adopted a franchise model that allowed the cartel to expand far beyond its original strongholds in Jalisco, Nayarit, and Colima by permitting local criminal organizations across Mexico to affiliate with the CJNG brand in exchange for regular tribute payments, an arrangement that gave regional commanders considerable autonomy over day-to-day operations while Oseguera retained centralized strategic direction from the top of a clearly defined hierarchical command structure. The result was an organization with genuinely national reach and local adaptability, a design that proved resilient precisely because it was not entirely dependent on any single point of authority or geography, meaning that even a blow as significant as the loss of its founder could not immediately collapse the network he had spent 15 years assembling. The cartel had announced its ruthless ambitions early, most memorably in September 2011, when members dumped 35 bodies on a busy Veracruz thoroughfare during peak hours in a deliberate act of public theater designed to communicate dominance to rivals, civilians, and the state alike, and it had maintained that strategy of spectacular violence as a form of institutional messaging ever since. The cartel's expansion had also brought it a central and catastrophic role in the trafficking of fentanyl into the United States, a trade that has fueled one of the most severe drug overdose crises in American history, claiming tens of thousands of lives each year. And Drug Enforcement Administration Administrator N. Milgram had testified before Congress that the CJNG and the Sinaloa cartel together represented the greatest criminal narcotics threat the United States had ever confronted. Mexican cartels obtain chemical precursors primarily from China, manufacture fentanyl in clandestine laboratories, distributed across multiple states, and transport the finished product across the border through hundreds of independent smuggling routes. And the sheer scale and decentralization of this infrastructure meant that no single arrest or elimination, however significant symbolically, could meaningfully disrupt the supply chain in any lasting way. Former D-Chief of International Operations Mike Vigil articulated this point directly, arguing that targeting cartel leadership without simultaneously dismantling the underlying logistical networks, the transportation infrastructure, money laundering operations, production facilities, and armed enforcement wings produces limited long-term results. Since removing one supplier creates market space for another to expand, and the fundamental economics of the trade, driven by cheap production costs and enormous demand, remain essentially unchanged. The political context surrounding Oseguera's death added further layers of significance beyond the purely operational, because Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum had been navigating sustained pressure from the Trump administration to demonstrate a harder and more visible line against cartel activity, particularly regarding fentanyl trafficking, which the American government had characterized as a form of chemical warfare against its own population. In February 2025, the United States had formally designated the CJNG and 5 other Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, and President Trump had repeatedly raised the possibility of unilateral American military action on Mexican soil to target cartel infrastructure directly, proposals that Sheinbaum had firmly and consistently rejected as violations of Mexican sovereignty and national dignity. Her government had nevertheless accelerated cooperation with Washington in tangible ways, extraditing dozens of suspected cartel members to the United States, deploying additional National Guard forces to the northern border, and intensifying domestic operations against trafficking networks with a frequency and visibility that had not characterized earlier periods. The elimination of El Mencho represented the most dramatic and symbolically loaded expression of this intensified posture, and it gave Sheinbaum the opportunity to demonstrate to both domestic and international audiences that Mexico was capable of confronting its most entrenched criminal threats without requiring the presence of foreign soldiers on its territory. For the Trump administration, meanwhile, the operation offered substantial political validation, providing concrete evidence in support of its characterization of the bilateral pressure campaign as effective and its framing of aggressive diplomacy as the appropriate instrument for achieving security outcomes. The security crisis that followed also cast a long and troubling shadow over one of the most significant international events Mexico had scheduled for the coming months, because Guadalajara had been designated as one of the host cities for the 2026 FIFA World Cup, with 4 matches slated to take place there, including a high-profile group stage encounter between Mexico and South Korea on June 18 that had already generated enormous anticipation among supporters of both nations. Jalisco state officials had projected that more than 1 million visitors would descend on the city during the tournament, and approximately $37 million had been committed to infrastructure improvements intended to accommodate that influx and showcase the city to a global audience. Against the backdrop of burning vehicles, armed roadblocks, emergency travel advisories from multiple foreign governments, and footage of cartel members patrolling streets with heavy weapons, those projections appeared increasingly precarious, and analysts tracking international tourism sentiment noted that visitors uncertain about safety conditions might choose to redirect their itineraries entirely toward matches scheduled in the United States or Canada. Earlier industry estimates had anticipated as many as 5.5 million foreign visitors to Mexico during the World Cup period, with consulting projections suggesting a direct economic contribution exceeding $1 billion. Figures constructed before cartel violence had grounded international airline service and sent tourists already on the ground scrambling for shelter. The cartel's demonstrated capacity to paralyze the country's tourism infrastructure within hours was interpreted by some observers not merely as an expression of grief or organizational distress at the loss of a leader, but as a calculated strategic demonstration, a public display of the organization's continuing ability to inflict severe economic and reputational damage at a moment and location of its choosing, with the implicit warning that it could do so again whenever it judged the circumstances to warrant such a response. With Oseguera gone, the question of succession settled immediately and heavily over the organization he had spent his adult life constructing, and unlike some criminal enterprises that cultivate visible heirs and prepare for leadership transitions with deliberate care, the CJNG had been structured in ways that concentrated enormous authority in his personal command, while the systematic targeting of his inner circle over recent years had left no single candidate clearly positioned to assume uncontested control. His brothers were in custody, one held in Mexico, the other extradited to the United States in 2025 amid internal cartel fears that his proximity to American prosecutors might have contributed to the intelligence that ultimately guided the Tapalpa raid, and his son Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, known as El Menchito, had been sentenced in March 2025 to life imprisonment plus 30 additional years, eliminating the most obvious dynastic succession. Among those considered most capable of competing for leadership were Juan Carlos Gonzalez Valencia, Oseguera's stepson and long-regarded operational head of the cartel's day-to-day activities. His daughter Jessica Johanna Oseguera Gonzalez, known internally as La Negra. Abelardo Flores Silva, a senior regional commander who controlled substantial CJNG territory along the Pacific coast. And Gonzalo Mendoza Gaitan, who managed operations in the Puerto Vallarta corridor. None of these figures, however capable in their respective domains, commanded the same combination of personal authority, institutional fear, and cross-regional respect that Oseguera had accumulated over more than a decade at the apex of the organization, and the fracture lines that had always existed between the cartel's semi-autonomous regional cells now threatened to widen into open conflict, particularly if rival organizations moved with speed and aggression to exploit the transitional moment. Chief among those rivals was the Sinaloa cartel, which, despite suffering its own significant internal disruptions following the arrests of its most senior leadership, retained well-established trafficking networks, deep institutional experience, and substantial territorial presence across multiple states. Should the CJNG fragment or become consumed by internal succession struggles, the Sinaloa organization was widely considered best positioned to reclaim corridors it had ceded to CJNG expansion over the preceding decade. Smaller but regionally consequential groups, among them the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel in Guanajuato, La Familia Michoacana and Los Viagras across Michoacán and Guerrero, and various competing factions active in Zacatecas, had also been pushed back during the CJNG's most aggressive expansion phase and could now identify genuine opportunities to reassert control over smuggling routes, extortion operations, and production infrastructure that had been effectively closed to them. historical precedent offered a sobering framework for anticipating what might come next. Because the death or capture of major cartel figures in Mexico had rarely produced lasting reductions in violence and had more often triggered extended periods of intensified conflict as successor factions competed internally for dominance, and rival organizations exploited moments of organizational weakness from the outside. And the CJNG itself had emerged from exactly such a crucible of chaos following the collapse of the Milenio cartel. The most plausible near-term trajectories were either a violent fragmentation of the cartel into competing regional factions or a rapid consolidation of power by a new leader capable of commanding sufficient loyalty from the network's disparate commanders to preserve its organizational coherence. Neither outcome offering much immediate promise of relief from the violence that had already reminded Mexico, its neighbors, and a watching international audience of how thoroughly and enduringly organized crime remained embedded in the country's institutional and social fabric, and of how much remained unresolved in a conflict that had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives over the preceding 2 decades, without producing anything approaching a definitive resolution. Sonnet 4.6